Hey, thanks for having me on YouTube, William. My name is Martin Blackwell. I'm a professor of history here in Dahlonega, Georgia, University of North Georgia. I came to Ukrainian in a sort of a typical way, I suppose, for an American. I studied German in high school and Russian in college, and I did a lot of study abroad when I was in college in Volgograd. I loved the Russian language, and I, of course, traveled to Kyiv even when I was on study abroad, and spent a long time working in the former Soviet Union in the 90s, and basically the question always came up, or what was told to me usually when I talked to people. I met a ton of people, because people were interested in talking to Americans big time back then, always was, the events of World War II and its effects on their families. And so the idea with studying Kyiv really was, the idea was, well, this was the largest city occupied by the Nazis during World War II. And also I always thought, hey, how was the Soviet Union a different place after the war? I mean, it was, of course, Stalin was still in power. They quickly became our major enemies at the beginnings of the Cold War. Was it the same Stalinism, after the country lost so many people, went through such a terrible experience during the 40s, as it had been in the 30s? And of course, growing up during the Cold War, going through college Russian classes and things like that, history classes, it was always, of course, the Great Terror was what marked Stalinism, was its defining characteristic, right? And so over a long period of time, including a Fulbright grant, one of the first Fulbright grants, a full student grant through International Institute of Education, I was in Kyiv for a whole year in the early 2000s, working in the archives, working in the party archive in Kyiv and the old archive of the October Revolution, which was the Soviet State Archive, in the Kyiv Oblast Archive, in the Kyiv City Archive. So I spent 11 months in the archive, sort of combing and trying to create a story of Kyiv's existence after the Soviets returned in 1943 on November 6th. And so eventually, in fact, actually, even really at the beginning, the whole idea was, how was the city resettled? This was an idea that people like my advisor at Indiana University, where I got my PhD, Hiroaki Koromiya, he really liked that idea. And my advisor in Ukraine at that point was the great Stanislav Kulchytsky of the Institute of Ukrainian History there in Kyiv. He really liked that. He thought that was, Zaselenie Gorod there right after the war. Well, that's a story that really hasn't been told all that closely. So, by all means, go ahead and try it. So, the book is is completely out of the archives in a lot of ways. It has an intro, of course, trying to lay the context, and the book is divided. Kyiv, as regime city, is divided up into three parts. The beginning is the resettlement of the city, as I said earlier, and I think you wanted to know about things that surprised me or things that would jump out, and really what I'm trying to do here is to get people to take a look at the book and either buy it or order it online. Or order it through interlibrary loan. It's in quite a lot of archives, including there in Toronto. When it comes to the resettlement of the city, I think what's surprising about it is that the place really wasn't as destroyed as all of that. Its housing was about 75% still intact, and yet the place was empty. The city only had about 200,000 people there at say, Christmas 1943. And it quickly filled up, of course, again. By the end of my story in early 47, it has almost 700,000 people officially, so it grows tremendously during that period. And the story is really about the arrival first of the Ukrainian population, which had lived through the war and emerges back there quickly from the forests and from hiding there after escaping the Nazis' efforts to evacuate them in fall of 43. They are sort of joined by these people who had lived through the occupation. They're soon joined by people arriving from evacuation, including a large Jewish population. An interesting sort of moment in the story is that by the end of it all, the city's Jewish population is about the same as it had been before the war. And so before the war, the city had about 1 million people, and its Jewish population was about 25%. And by the end of my story, it has, as I said, 700,000, and its Jewish population is about 20%. So it's really, considering, what happened to the Jews of Ukraine during World War II, I mean, this is a rather dramatic story in that they return in various ways. The city leaders, the arriving communists, tried to control the arrival people, but they failed. There were a lot of things going on, a lot of bribery. People came back through bribery. People came back through the laws of the land, and this is one of the key points in that the laws of the land were designed during the war to help the country win the war. And so what that meant was, those fighting, their apartments were bonded to them. And a lot of people from Kyiv were fighting in the war. So, in fact, about 200,000 men, basically, and some women, are, a fifth of the city fights from the very beginnings of World War II against the Nazis. And then, of course, more added later when the returning Soviets arrive. So, the local fathers, the local communists, they're the ones, it's really, in a lot of ways, of course, a story about them. It's their archives in a lot of ways. I think that it's not unfair to say that the local communists were, from Nikita Khrushchev on down, were obviously in charge of the place and had and their goals, of course, were to bring it back into the Soviet regime as quickly as possible, make it as useful as possible to Moscow in its efforts to defeat the Nazis. And the story of resettlement is really just about dislocation. I mean, and in fact, actually, the front moves off to the west, but behind it, the Soviets are not paying as much attention as all that to the movements of people. What they're concerned about is finding people for the front. And in fact, actually, there are a lot of things, a lot of sort of compromises that the Soviets make with people's pasts, because, of course, the major goal is defeating the Nazis. And so your readers will have to see that this population, which emerges by the end of the story, is a very different population than it had been there before, because in the 1930s, that place, Kyiv, was combed and sort of landscaped, I guess you could say the population was, as Amir Weiner would use, and it was very much something that was predictable. I mean, they'd sort of gotten rid of anybody who was questionable, but after the war, there were a lot of people there in Kyiv who were rather questionable. So that's how the place is set up. The next part of the book is about the reassembly. Who actually were these people in detail? There's a whole chapter on the communists themselves, the elite, and efforts to sort of make sure that group of people doesn't get too big, because there are only so many resources to go around. The book is obviously material scarcity plays a huge role in it, and that's really, I think, one of its great additions to the literature, as scant as it is really by Westerners on Ukraine's experience during World War II, is to really just sort of bring in the nuts and bolts of sort of daily survival there on the ground in the 40s. We can talk about ideology and the myth of the war and all that sort of thing, and how it changed or how it was the same. But what really mattered to a lot of people was, hey, do I have a roof over my head? Do I have something to eat? Do I have some clothes on? Things like that. And so in a lot of ways, the party is, of course, responsible for distributing all of that, and they're very careful about limiting their growth in order to make sure that people aren't unduly envious of those who do get into the party and those who don't after the return from the East. There's a whole chapter on the different groups of what I call the masses. That's beginning with the Ukrainians who lived through the occupation, the evacuees, are a second group. All of whom, of course, have family members who were fighting in the front. So, of course, the evacuees include that large Jewish population that I talked about. I should say that, I said about 1 million people lived there before the war. The book does go through all the statistics, right? I mean, there are 200,000 there after the war. 350,000 were evacuated. Almost 150,000 or so were killed during the war. So it sort of does 200, as I said, 200,000 people are brought into the Red Army. So it all it does make sense statistically for people. And the other groups of people who, of course, reassemble in the city. There are some interesting sections of the book about what were the forced laborers, Soviet forced laborers. In other words, people who were sort of conscripted to help rebuild. And that's the book's argument is that's a great failure because nobody wants to work for peanuts and complete peanuts. So there's great labor scarcity. And so, some people like my colleague Don Filzer have talked a lot about that. And that allows for a lot of latitude to work, to move around. And people are really competing. Factory owners, mine owners, or I should say managers, are really desperate to find people. So there's a lot of room to maneuver there amongst people. And the last group, I should say the second to last group would be the German POWs, who that was one of the surprising things, of course, was that by the end of the story, there are 27,000 German POWs working in Kyiv trying to rebuild it. So, and they are like a major part of the actual labor force as far as people working in factories. And the local authorities, they want to rebuild housing, but of course, the economy is managed by Moscow from the top down, and Moscow is just interested in industrial or production of other things besides, living quarters for people. So that's a huge problem. And finally, you have the arrival at the end of the demobilized Red Army soldiers and officers, and they're a really prickly group because quite a few of them are members of the Communist Party, so they've got these great expectations for the future, and they're sort of rather entitled group, and they do a lot of pressure on the local authorities. The last part of the book is probably the sort of, I would say, well, probably most interest readers overall, and that is how do the local authorities relegitimize Soviet power? Despite the fact that, of course, the Red Army is winning, the Soviet Union is winning, it's still questionable because, of course, there's terrible conditions there, and these guys are sort of responsible for everything that happens. So how do they make themselves look good in front of the population? How do they make themselves look like they're actually getting things done? And make sure that there's not any sort of social disorder there in the rear, because, of course, that was the biggest problem that the Soviet regime was always worried about, right? Was social disorder in its cities. That's sort of a part of the narrative of the 1930s. The people like David Shearer and Paul Hagenlow have talked about in their books on the sort of NKVD state that existed there really during that period, which of course still exists after the war, at least on paper. And so in that section of the book, last chapter, really, we've got actually last two chapters. First of all, there's all sorts of efforts in the book also looks at Kiev's newspapers. I worked for a very long while in the Academy of Sciences library there in the newspaper reading room right across from Taras Shevchenko Park in downtown Kyiv. And I won't give it all away there, but let's just say that there were a lot of things didn't work out for the local communists. Right, as I said, the city was filling up with people they couldn't they didn't know who they were. Sometimes they didn't know where they were working, and there's a lot in the text about how that actually happens and the sort of ways in which it was possible to get back to the city, which I think people will find pretty fascinating. The first two chapters are a whole narrative of that story. And ultimately, there are a lot of efforts that are made to talk about the future and about what the Soviet Union means, but it sort of like tries to build modernity, and it's possible to do that. The text, it really sort of fits into the literature overall because, of course, the ideology of the Soviet state after the war was it was known as Soviet patriotism. And it really sort of combined the nationalism of the moment, the Russian-led nationalism of the moment, with this idea that obviously, wasn't it obvious that what the Soviets were trying to create was a more equitable, just polity, and together that's what people would be trying to do. They're led by the Russians. Okay, so it was a sort of like the idea was, the state was necessary. It was not going anywhere, and something doesn't at all fit in with Marxist ideology. Of course, I think it's something different. It's like the state is all important and all meaningful, way more so, I think, really than it was even in the 30s. And so how does Kyiv fit into that story as sort of being a good sort of citizen or a good subject of the regime? It's going to do that through propaganda, and the last section there in Chapter 5 talks about what kind of propaganda is used to sort of like fit Kyiv into that story. But I should say that, they sort of come to those conclusions based off of all that I've talked about earlier in the book, right? The place is difficult to settle. It's difficult to control. It's difficult to sort of manage its reconstruction. There's a whole lot of failure there. And so, there's sort of recourse to the fact that, well, hey, at least we're around as a strong state. The alternative is chaos. That's what we're trying to get at here. Why does that make sense to people there at that point? And the last chapter is sort of a reverse of looking at how the people respond to all of that, or at least respond to their leaders. And there's a lot in there about anti-Semitism, unfortunately, because, of course, that was a major animator of people's actions due to, I think, mainly their battling over resources. Okay, so I think readers are going to find that first part of Chapter 6 really interesting. The argument in a lot of ways is that things are coming from below here, and that the Stalin regime is sort of reacting to events from below. So it's I think a little eye-opening, a little surprising to people when they read that section, and I think but in my opinion, that's really how history does work. Leaders they're acting, but they're responding to events from below, I think, usually. And that last section also includes all sorts of information about the crime that existed in the city and the corruption that existed in the city. What I'm trying to do there is really sort of set the scene for, I think, the type of polity that existed there after World War II, and that the crime is led by the Soviet military, the guys who are like used to be in the maybe run away or deserted from the military during the war. There's a whole bunch of them, and they're sort of. But there's also a lot of people who are just sort of they've been demobilized, and they're sort of responsible for some of the crime there. A lot of the crime seen in Kyiv. Of course, the city's leaders are distributing the resources, so they've got great access to things. There's all sorts of information in there about the way those guys are living their lives during the war, during these strenuous times. And so I sort of try to set the scene, I think, there for some of the tendencies which we've seen and which we know existed within the Soviet Union in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s, as far as the state of shortage with the economy and sort of things that are going on as people try to make ends meet in a lot of ways. So that's what the book's about, and I hope that people will want to get their hands on it. And I think it's a coherent, cogent whole. I think it sort of does uncover cuts through a lot of mythology that exists about how the place lived there in the 40s and the 50s, or at least began to live there in the 50s.